Welcome. Congratulations for your wisdom in joining this webinar to learn a little about decarbonizing transportation in New York City. As our success in reducing methane and greenhouse gases depends on each one of us. We have two great speakers who will guide us on this learning path, Alison Considine and Wayne Arden. We will hear more about their backgrounds. And I just want to make sure that everybody here is able to hear. Okay. Okay. My name is Catherine Skopik, and I'm your host for this evening. And I'm both chair of Sierra Club New York City Group and the Sustainability Series. And I'm an activist, artist, and educator. And now, with all of us, we have the virtual potential of having a learning experience beyond any classroom. We'll start with Wayne, then hear from Allison. As they are speaking, if you have any question, jot it down on a piece of paper or in the chat. And after both Allison and Wayne have presented, then we will have Q&A. Okay, so first of all, we will hear from Wayne. And Wayne has an extensive background in finance. From early 2003 to early 2009, Wayne was SVP of sales for NASDAQ's, formerly OMX, market technology division in the Americas, focusing on exchanges, alternative trading systems, and clearinghouses. While at OMX and then NASDAQ, Wayne grew market technology revenues in the Americas by nearly a factor of 10/6. Many of the contracts signed with customers were worth tens of millions of dollars. In his last year, his team won business worth $84 million. In earlier positions at IBM and elsewhere, he concentrated on brokerage and compliance systems, software and systems engineering, marketing, and business strategy. In 2009, Wayne left NASDAQ to become an independent consultant. In 2009 and periodically in subsequent years, Wayne worked on behalf of Carbon Recycling International, CRI, helping to write CRI's business plan and raise money for its pilot plant. CRI was one of the first companies to recycle carbon dioxide in volume, using it as a feedstock to produce renewable methanol. Wayne worked as a consultant for DoD's Task Force for Business and Stability Operations, or TFBSO, from February 2013 through April 2014, spending time in Afghanistan during 3 extended trips. His work in Afghanistan centered around strengthening the agricultural and financial systems. More recently, in 2019, Wayne worked as a consultant for the Asian Development Bank. He advised the financial regulator of an Asian country regarding the viability of creating a commodity exchange. Wayne holds a BA from Dartmouth College and an MBA and MS from Columbia University. He served on an FIA, Futures Industry Association, committee for several years and has written opinions about the financial crisis and other topics in Wall Street and Technology Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and other publications. He has passed the U.S. National Futures Association, or NFA, Series 3 exam, and is a U.S. citizen. Wayne, tell us a little bit about how we moved, or how you moved, from the financial industry along with and into working on environmental issues.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize you were going to recount that much of my bio. Well, thank you. That's so let's first see if we can bring up the presentation. Shall we do that?
Okay.
I need to screen share. Where did it go? Here it is. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. Proposed New York City municipal zero emissions.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much for that extensive introduction. What I'd like to do in the next number of minutes is talk a little bit about the work I've done recently in finance and how that relates to this topic. And then we'll talk about emissions in general, and then more specifically emissions in transportation and the rise of electric vehicles, i.e. EVs. And then more specifically, potential legislation that New York City could adopt to accelerate progress and reduce emissions, and some closing thoughts. So that's what we have in front of us in the next half an hour or so. So let's get started. There we go. So you heard a little bit about my background in finance. When I was working on that assignment for the Asian Development Bank a couple of years ago, at the same time, I published an article I wrote got published by the Futures Industry Association called the EV Disruption. And what that article argues is that we are poised on a really interesting change in energy, where we're moving from oil as the world's most important commodity to electricity. And I wrote this article and based it on a model that I developed that looked at the rise of EVs and predicted when that effect of oil not consumed will get to the point where it's as large as a typical OPEC production move, which is about 1 million barrels a day. And that should happen in the relatively near future, around 2024, 2025. And from that point, OPEC's pricing power will begin to diminish. And so we are just in the throes of this massive transformation occurring away from oil and towards electricity. And maybe we've been in the oil era, depending on how you count, for 150 years, since Standard Oil was created by John D. Rockefeller in 1870. Maybe it's since 1908 when the Ford Model T was announced, but this era, it's clear now that it's beginning to end. And this is important because 2/3 of global oil demand serves transportation uses. So if we begin to use EVs, we will start diminishing the use of oil. Financial markets in New York City and other places are anticipating this transition. So if you look at Exxon, for example, that's a really good example to highlight this trend. Exxon was ranked first not that long ago in market cap, and now it's 27th. Apple's market cap is much larger. And then there's a whole movement in finance called the ESG movement, or environmental, social, and governance. And that relates to the 17 sustainable development goals that the UN has set out to help governments make progress. And a number of those goals relate to the environment, and that's the E in ESG. And New York City is vying with London to be a center of this style of financing, and especially green financing, which is the E in ESG. And I would say one firm that to keep an eye on and to really watch, which has become a leader in this movement, is BlackRock. And if you're not familiar with BlackRock, they're headquartered here in New York City. They are the world's largest asset manager, some $9 trillion in assets that they manage. So they sit on the boards of many of US companies. And BlackRock has been very proactive in announcing their concern about climate change and urging the companies that they represent, whose stock they own, to take more proactive action. So the CEO, Larry Fink, has a letter that he publishes once a year. In his most recent letter, he urges companies to disclose a plan for how their businesses will be compatible with a net zero economy. And so I think it's fair to say that the financial community in general, and especially here in New York and London, is very much aware of the threat from climate change, and is trying, and in many cases, is trying to be helpful and to affect change. The third area of overlap, I won't spend much time on, it's emissions trading. Just briefly, New York participates in the second emissions trading system there, which is called RGGI, and raises about $130 million a year through auctions, and then spends that money to mitigate the effects of climate change. But the first two are relevant to our talk today. Okay, this this screen is from a Swedish consulting firm, EV Volumes. I think it shows really nicely the rise of electric vehicles and the end of the ICE age, which is a bit of a pun, but ICE is the acronym for internal combustion engine vehicles. And there are a couple of things to highlight from this chart. You can see the growth is nonlinear. And the starting point maybe was 2008. That's when Tesla first started selling its first electric vehicle, the Roadster. And in 2008, which is not even on the graph, sales were negligible from a global perspective. But now EVs, and these are really vehicles with a plug, which includes battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid vehicles. They represent 4.2% of the global market. And the biggest, the part of the world that's moving the fastest is Europe. And within Europe, the country that's moving the fastest is Norway. So the sales figures for Norway in January, some 80% of the sales of new vehicles in Norway in January had a plug. So EVs are accelerating in sales. So one might say, well, the market is working, the sales are accelerating. Maybe we don't need to take proactive action. Maybe the market is sufficient. Unfortunately, we need to do more. And the problem is that we just don't have much time to combat global warming. And viscerally, we are feeling this every day. So in New York this winter, we've only had 4 days, including yesterday, when the high was below freezing. And that certainly wasn't the case decades ago. So on a daily basis, we see this in New York City. And of course, we see it to the instance of major storms, hurricanes, glaciers melting, and all sorts of effects. The UN, as we all know, is the group that is leading the charge to get governments around the world to do more about climate change. And the UN comes out with a report every 6 or 7 years or so that's very detailed. The one in 2013 was pretty dark, as you see from that quote. And more recently, just a few days ago, there was a report released by 2 professors from the University of Washington, which is really helpful in understanding where we stand. And the news is not so good. So based on current trends, the probability that we can limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the UN goal, is only 5%. However, in the bad news, there's some good news, and that is with some increases. So this, for the United States, that would be 30% more reductions in emissions than what the United States committed to in the Paris Agreements in 2015. Then we can, with reasonable probability, limit the rise. So the point is, it's feasible, it's possible, it's not 200%, 300%. So in this recent study, there's some really stark news, but also perhaps cause for some optimism. But it's clear that we need to do more. And there are a number of examples of where government intervention and regulation has been super helpful in tackling the problem of climate change. Indeed, you can argue Tesla's success is due to actions that California took to create a zero emission vehicle market starting as far back as 1990. So it's not an accident that Tesla was born in California. And just as a general statement, it's super helpful, any entrepreneur will tell you this, to have a favorable local market. It's really hard to create a company where the local market is not favorable. So California really helped Tesla in creating that initial market. And that regulation helped Tesla and is now helping others get started. If you look at a New York example, the New York passed a renewable portfolio standard in 2004, like many other states, that specified 50% of energy production by utilities by 2030. You know, that's had a really positive effect in stimulating growth in the solar energy and the wind energy in the state. And of course, we hope that the climate bill passed in 2019 will do the same. So in short, government intervention is needed to make the necessary progress that we need. All right, briefly, emissions. In 2018, emissions from transportation surpassed utilities in the United States. So electricity related emissions are the second largest category. And then if you look at this pie chart of the various components of this, the largest ones are light duty vehicles, the kinds of vehicles that consumers purchase up to about an F-150 pickup truck in size. And then the second largest category is medium and heavy duty trucks. Now, of these categories, what's relevant to New York City is light duty vehicles and the medium duty trucks. New York City doesn't purchase many heavy duty trucks like a semi, for example. All right, so I think it's important really to address a question that shows up in the press still. And sometimes you run into arguments that, well, EVs don't really reduce emissions. And the arguments made are, they're usually one or two or both. And one argument is because in many places power comes from coal, it's generated by coal-fired power plants, that EVs probably don't reduce emissions. And another argument is that the carbon intensity of manufacturing EVs, and more specifically the batteries, is larger than the equivalent internal combustion engine cars, and therefore EVs are not as clean. So both of these arguments are false, and I think it's important to highlight studies, comprehensive studies that have been done that look at the total picture. And it's really important to look at the complete supply chain for both internal combustion engine vehicles and EVs. So if you think about the complete supply chain for traditional vehicles, you have to include the supply chain for oil. So it's the drilling for oil. Once you've got the crude, you've got to transport it by truck or by pipeline or by rail to a refinery. Then you have to refine it. Refineries, they're right up there with steel plants and regarding emissions. And then you have to get that gasoline, the finished product, to the end user, again, usually by truck or rail. So when you do an apples to apples comparison, as the Union of Concerned Scientists has done, it's clear that EVs are far cleaner than their equivalent cousins of internal combustion engines. So this study was done in 2015, and then the Union of Concerned Scientists has updated it since then. And you can see that EVs on average are getting around 88 miles per gallon, which is far better than the average for ICE vehicles. And it's a little easier to see this in a graph. So if we move to a nice picture of the United States, you'll see that it varies by region, and it varies primarily by the percentage of renewable energy and the lack of coal. So in New York City, you can see that EVs are the equivalent of 100 miles per gallon. So they are far cleaner than equivalent ICE vehicles. In the Midwest and the South, they aren't, the difference isn't quite as dramatic, but that's because those places have a higher percentage of coal-generated power. But every couple of years, the number, when the Union of Concerned Scientists updates this study, the numbers get better as we use more and more renewable energy and less coal. So that's one comprehensive study. Let me mention two just briefly. There's been two done by European entities, one by a collection of universities that looked globally, that found in 95% of the 53 regions that they looked at that EVs emit fewer emissions than ICE vehicles. And then one focused on Europe by Transport and Environment, which is a kind of a think tank that focuses on renewable energy. And you should pay attention to that first bullet. So it is true that the carbon intensity of making electric vehicles is higher due to the batteries, but that effect doesn't last long. And what they found is the carbon debt in this study was about a year longer. So if you look at their map of Europe, you can see that here, for example, is a worst case scenario because most of the power in Poland is generated by coal, and EVs are 30% better. But then look at Sweden, where most of the electricity is renewable. There's a lot of hydroelectricity generated in Sweden, and EVs are far better in Sweden. So similar results to the Union of Concerned Scientists study. So you can rest assured that EVs, when you do an apples to apples comparison of both supply chains, are far cleaner than cars with internal combustion engines. All right, so let's talk about proposed legislation, what we could do, what we as New Yorkers could do to accelerate progress. And I think the starting point is Mayor de Blasio did issue an executive order last year, 53 in February, saying that by 2040, the fleets of New York City should be all electric. And what this proposed legislation would do, that we at the Sierra Club in New York City think that the New York City should consider, is that this would accelerate that time frame about 10 years. This is a little bit of a busy chart. I'm just focused on the deadline. So what the deadline is for general purpose vehicles, it's 2025. And a general purpose vehicle is a vehicle that is basically the same as what consumers buy. So you've seen the vehicles that, for example, traffic officers use. Those often are Toyota Priuses, for example, or the vehicles that building inspectors use. There's standard vehicles bought off the lot from car manufacturers. So those we are proposing that the city starts buying only zero emission vehicles in 2025. And then 2030, more specialized vehicles like pursuit rated police cars and school buses and fire trucks and so on in 2030. The TLC perhaps has the most work to do. So the deadline is split for the TLC, that the TLC should focus on medallion vehicles in the near term and others in the longer term. So let's break this down a little bit. So this slide represents a conversation that one might have with a fleet manager in New York City, outlining what are the advantages of an electric vehicle. Electric vehicles, because of the characteristics of motors, have really good acceleration and handling characteristics, and they are safer than ICE vehicles. And here, this is basic physics at work. If you think about being in a traditional vehicle, not if you're the driver or the passenger in the right-hand seat, just a few inches in front of you is a very heavy, large engine. And in the event of an accident, that engine can slam forward or backwards, as it were, and enter the passenger compartment and cause injuries or worse, or death. Well, that heavy engine doesn't exist in an electric vehicle. The motors are much smaller, much lighter, and they're mounted in the vehicle lower. So that effect doesn't happen. And moreover, the manufacturers can design the front of the vehicle to better absorb the energy of a crash. So they are, if designed properly, inherently safer. They have lower maintenance costs, about 70% fewer moving parts. That's kind of an approximate figure because there's some debate as to what a moving part is. I mean, do you count ball bearings, for example? But the point is that an EV has many fewer, so it doesn't have pistons or crankshafts or timing belts, oil pumps, all this stuff that is moving, rotating, going up and down. And so that leads to lower maintenance issues. And beyond this, I'd keep in mind that some of those parts are operating under conditions of high pressure and temperature, which in general is not the case for an EV. And then there's some cases where it's a matter of degrees. So for example, in an EV, the brakes don't wear out as quickly, because with EVs, one can do regenerative braking, where under normal circumstances, you don't touch the brakes. The motor runs backwards as a generator, generates electricity. That's what slows down the car. So maintenance costs are lower. The energy costs are lower. On average, electricity is 50% less expensive than gasoline across the United States. And insurance costs will be lower. They aren't lower yet in general, but they will be as insurance companies react to the lower costs. As an aside, Tesla has become frustrated with the insurance companies and so has gotten into the insurance business in California, soon Texas, and is offering discounts of about up to 20% versus what Geico and others offer. So the large insurance companies are going to have to react. So there are disadvantages, but the key point here is that they are disappearing rapidly. So historically, electric vehicles have suffered from a higher purchase price, but that will disappear soon. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So historically, they've had a shorter range than their cousins, but that is nearly done. The more expensive vehicles, for example, a Tesla Model S, that's not a vehicle that probably New York City would buy, but that vehicle has a range now of over 400 miles, so about the same as a BMW or a Mercedes with an internal combustion engine. The charging times are declining. They may not ever quite get to the 5 minutes that it takes to fill up a large gasoline tank, but they're getting to the point where it's not an inhibitor. And note that for certain uses, like for special purpose vehicles, consider a sanitation truck, it's not really a problem because the truck goes out for 8 to 12 hours, then comes back and it has a number of hours to recharge. And lastly, an issue is availability, but now there are hundreds of vehicles that are about to be released in the United States and elsewhere. So let's look at the initial purchase price. That's a really important thing. It relates to this bill, the 2025 deadline and the 2030 deadline. So the price of lithium-ion battery packs has declined dramatically. I mean, it's now from about $1,000 a decade or so ago to around $125 now per kilowatt hour. And what a lot of the experts believe is that the tipping point where the initial purchase price of an EV is the same as its counterpart is around 100 in developed countries, in the United States and Europe and Japan and elsewhere. And we are close to that. So Bloomberg recently ran an article saying that's a couple years out that the industry should hit that $100 number by 2023. And one of the experts in the country of chemical engineering is a Stanford professor, Yi Shui, and Professor Shui predicts that this price reduction will continue and should be around $75 per kilowatt hour by 2030. In other words, EVs will become less expensive than their counterpoints. And the point that he makes is that this is due to advances in battery chemistry that we can see that are in the pipeline now, and economies of scale. So around availability, right now, New York City could buy vehicles from GM, Hyundai, Nissan, Tesla, and VW. And most of these companies manufacture in the US. VW will start manufacturing EVs in the US in 2022. And then there's a whole host of new vehicles that will be announced and available before 2025. Let me focus in particular on Ford and GM because New York City buys vehicles from those two. Ford announced in its recent earnings call last week that it's doubling its investments in electrification and electric vehicles to $22 billion through 2025. And GM has said that it will launch 30 EVs by 2025, and 2/3 of those will be available in the United States. And there's a whole slew of electric vans and pickup trucks coming by the majors such as Ford and GM, but also by a number of startups. And electric motorcycles are already available by two leading American manufacturers. So let's say by 2023, there will be many choices across all of the general categories in general purpose vehicles. You may have seen in the Super Bowl sort of a funny ad with Will Ferrell, and he challenged in this ad Norway. He said, it's terrible, Norway is beating the United States in electric vehicles and we need to do better. And so he's referencing Norway's leadership that I mentioned earlier. So some of you may have seen that ad a couple of days ago. So if we look at special purpose vehicles, these are the vehicles that various parts of the New York City administration buy. The key takeaway here is that in many cases, there are a lot of suppliers now. So for sanitation trucks and school buses in particular, there are multiple choices for New York City today. In other categories, there are some choices. So for example, in pursuit-rated police cars, there are police departments around the country that have purchased Tesla Model 3s and are beginning to purchase Model Y. And so there's New York City and Street Cleaners buys a plurality, it may be a majority of street cleaners from Global Environment Products. There's a zero emission offering there today. There are two leading manufacturers of ambulances in North America, the REV Group and Demers. Demers will start offering one next year. So in many of these categories, there are choices today, and there will certainly be more choices by 2030. And in general, what a city like New York wants is 3 choices per category, and if possible, choices that are manufactured in North America or the United States. And let me just highlight ambulances, because that's a really exciting and important one. A couple of years ago, I engaged with one of the major medical systems here in New York City, and they have a public affairs department, so I probably can't mention them without going through their public affairs department. But with a physician at their major hospital, we looked at the possibility of electric ambulances and reached out to try to see if we could get an automaker interested in that application. And there's a benefit that it's very surprising, and it's not one that you would know unless you were from this industry, but it turns out that if you think about it, operating rooms are very close to the main door to hospital, and they have to be. So someone comes in a desperate condition, you want to get that patient to the operating room quickly, no long hallway or an elevator to another floor. Well, the problem in New York City is in the summer especially, these ambulances that have diesel engines are idling just outside the operating room waiting to go on a call. And the fumes drift into the operating room. So sometimes the condition of the air in the operating room is suboptimal. That's clearly a problem that an EV would solve. And perhaps one can reimagine how an ambulance works so that one could put new equipment that requires electricity in the ambulance to help patients that's not feasible now. So that's a really important application. So what are other entities doing around New York City, in particular the MTA and the Port Authority? New York City, of course, influences the MTA and has seats on the board, but does not run the MTA. The MTA has 25 or so electric buses in operation, and has made the statement in a recent oversight committee meeting that will start purchasing electric transit buses, only electric transit buses by 2028. So that's consistent with the proposal in this bill. And of all of the agencies, I think Port Authority is doing the most. They're making a lot of progress in electrifying the fleet that serves airports in the New York City area, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark. They haven't yet focused on commuter transit buses, and that is possible too. If you look at buses from Proterra, they have, some of these buses have ranges of 300 miles or more, and that's plenty to handle a consumer route coming in from, let's say, a distant New Jersey suburb to the Port Authority bus terminal. So that's what other agencies are doing, and particularly, I think that's consistent with the deadlines in this proposed legislation. Now, this slide is a little busy. It's about relative examples that other governments, state governments and national governments are doing. Let me just highlight 2 California and now Massachusetts as well is calling for banning the purchase of internal combustion light duty vehicles starting in 2035. Those are probably the most ambitious examples here in the United States. And similarly, there are many countries in Europe that have put in place plans to do the same thing. I would just like to highlight Switzerland because I think that's an example that's relevant to this bill. Switzerland has already started purchasing only EVs for the Swiss federal government, and that has started in this year, in 2021. So again, I think the deadlines in this potential legislation are consistent with other efforts. Oh, and one other important thing, President Biden in a press conference on January the 25th, stated that the US will phase out fossil fuel vehicles in the federal fleet. And now that's a lot of vehicles, 625,000 vehicles. But he didn't give a time frame. So, but at least the direction is set. All right. Sometimes in talking about EVs, the discussion tends towards mining. I'll talk about these first two topics briefly. The third one is more important. Rare earth elements are at the bottom of the periodic table. If you remember your chemistry, they start at the element 57. And there are a few rare earth elements that are useful in making DC motors. The reason why this is of concern for automakers is that most of these elements come from China. That's where both they're mined and processed. China restricted exports in 2005, and then in a dispute with Japan, halted them to Japan in 2010. And that got a lot of people worried around the world about the supply of these elements. The US Defense Department in particular, because many of these elements are really helpful in defense applications, and some of them have few substitutes. The situation has changed a bit. There are now some alternatives, but still China is the leading supplier and processor of these elements. From an automaker point of view, I think in the boardrooms, Ford, GM, VW, Tesla, I'm sure they follow this issue, but there are alternatives. So it's one can use designs other than permanent magnet DC motors. And in fact, in Tesla cars, they use both. They use DC motors in cars that have two motors. One is asynchronous, one is DC. But the point is that there are alternatives. So this issue is probably not of first rank for automakers, but it's a very big concern for the US Department of Defense. Cobalt, that's been a concern in the supply chain for electric vehicles. And the problem is that Angola is a source of about 50% of the cobalt worldwide. And the provenance of the cobalt is poor. And there are problems with child labor. There are problems with various guerrilla groups that use cobalt mining to finance their activities. So EV manufacturers and mobile phone manufacturers like Apple are both attempting to use less cobalt and to diversify supply. Tesla stated that its goal is to eliminate all use of cobalt. So that's an issue that relates to the supply chain. The most important thing to mention is the third topic. The aim is to have a circular economy for the batteries involved in electric vehicles and in stationary storage. And it's important to note that we've succeeded in doing this for lead acid batteries. So 99% of the lead acid batteries in the US, and I presume in Europe, are successfully recycled. And think about how important that is. If that weren't the case and these batteries were ending up in landfills, they would pollute the ground table and the water supply, and we'd regularly be having problems along the likes of what Flint, Michigan experienced a few years ago. So this has been a really important objective. And if this can be done for lead acid batteries, it can be done for lithium ion batteries and similar chemistries. So if you think about what this means, the mining activity needed to support the increase in EVs will increase over the next couple of decades, but it's going to reach a steady state and then decline as battery recycling happens more and more. And just remember that first chart, or that early chart, where the growth of EVs is nonlinear, it's exponential. So the age of most EVs is very young. I mean, most of the sales have been the last couple of years. So it will be a decade or two before recycling really kicks in, but it is feasible. And where I think there's cause for optimism and hope is the last bullet. So J.B. Straubel was one of the co-founders of Tesla. He left a few years ago, and he's founded a battery recycling company called Redwood Materials. They have started work. They are recycling battery materials sourced from Panasonic's factory in Nevada. So far, the scale is small, but you've got to start somewhere. And most importantly, he believes that recycled batteries, their price can be only 50% of new batteries by 2030. And that's really encouraging news. That means that this business can succeed. So the aim is a circular economy a decade or two from now, where the batteries are substantially recycled. And one last point, if you remember that Union of Concerned Scientists study and the others in Europe, they did not assume recycling. So as recycling accelerates and starts to happen, the effect of EVs in reducing emissions will be even greater. So we're to the second to last slide here. Another reason why this transition is so important is jobs. And the first point, I haven't seen people discussing this point in public, and it's a really important point to raise about the effect, this enormous effect that we're beginning to experience of moving from oil to electricity. So New York State consumes about $8 billion of gasoline and distillate fuel. And if you use, this is a recent price per gallon, early February for New York State, that's about $15.5 billion. And that's money that's going to other states or other countries, because we import oil, or buy oil, maybe it's a better term, in New York State, sourced from other states and other countries. But if we substitute electricity for that oil, we'll be spending that money in state, about 85% of it. New York State does import some electricity from Canada, from both Ontario and Quebec, but roughly about 15% of the electricity we consume. So something like 85% of this number, 16 billion or so, will be spent in state, and that will be spent on businesses related to EVs, to wind energy, solar energy, utilities, distribution of energy, recharging infrastructure. So that is a really powerful effect that gradually would become stronger and stronger. And it's in New York State's interest to accelerate it. The bullets below are three specific cases of where jobs have been created. And New York State is doing well in generating jobs in the solar energy. Tesla has a factory in Buffalo that's, per the most recent report I can find, has generated 1,500 jobs, which met its promise to New York State as of last year. I think Tesla's promise over a 10-year period is to generate 5,000 jobs in New York. And then recent news, which is very exciting, in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, there'll be a facility to assemble new wind turbine plants, and those turbines rather, and those are the turbines that will be installed offshore. And the takeaway from these three bullets is that it's really hard to generate jobs in the thousands. So economic development officers in New York City and New York State that try to generate, help businesses generate jobs in the city and the state get very excited when the numbers are in the thousands. So let's try to conclude here. If we compare to what some other cities are doing, I think maybe the leading example is Shenzhen in China, which is just over the border from Hong Kong. They have in operation 12,000 electric buses and 6,000 electric taxis. If I compare that to New York City has last year approved the Tesla Model 3 as its first approved model as an electric taxi. And there was one in operation, but it just was in an accident. So I think we're back to zero. So we've got a lot of work to do on that front, we being New York City. London has 250 electric buses in operation and about 2,000 electric taxis. Moscow has a number of electric transit buses in operation. There are other cities in London and Europe that have made considerable progress. So New York has a ways to go to reach these types of examples. Yet New York City is the biggest operator of vehicles in the country. So New York has the potential to mitigate lots of emissions and be an example for the country and perhaps other cities around the world. As you know, in 2019, New York City passed the Climate Mobilization Act, and that indeed is an example of leadership. I happened to listen to a presentation, Stanford presentation this past summer, where the director of the IEA, the International Energy Association, spoke. And that the IEA is a think tank that focuses on energy in general and renewable energy in particular. They're based in Paris. And the director really praised New York City as an example of leadership and one that other countries and cities should follow. So that's a wonderful example of seizing the initiative, but it relates to one sector, which is the building sector. And we really need to focus on other sectors as well. And I think a key point is that progress is possible in ground transportation, more so than in others. The challenges of reducing emissions in agricultural and industrial applications are arguably tougher. And the problem that confronts us is so difficult that we need to make progress as soon as possible where we can. And this is one where we can. So if I come back to the one of the first slides and make a financial analogy, reducing emissions is a lot like compound interest. So to the extent that we can reduce emissions now in the immediate future, those benefits will compound. But to the extent we don't and are not proactive, the harm will compound. So as New Yorkers, I think we have a special responsibility. The UN headquarters is here. That's the organization that is really trying to lead the world in combating climate change. And we should really do our utmost to make New York an example for other cities, both American and non-American. And lastly, given that I work in the financial industry, I think most people who work in the financial industry agree that climate change is a threat and see the opportunity of this massive transition from oil to electricity and would be supportive. So thank you very much. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to cover, and so thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. I
should say one other thing, just as a disclosure. I do own stock in Ford and Tesla, so I need to disclose that. So.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay. Just one quick question before we leave and go to Allison. Was there a slide on the legislation that you're proposing, the basic points of the legislation before we leave, so that we can have, that's in our mind when we come back to the legislation?
This was the slide,
okay, thank you.
Rather busy one. And the key thing to remember are the deadlines: 2025 for general purpose vehicles, 2030 for special purpose vehicles.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. Oh boy, okay, we have a long way to go here, catching up to all of our other countries, cities, and to uphold the good work that is being done and encourage it to move more quickly and more largely. Okay, Alison Considine is our next speaker. And Allison is the New York-based campaign representative, and she was with Clean Transportation for All campaign and is now moved to the Clean Coal campaign. And if I can just take a moment, and I'd like to read something. This was in my Defender's periodical, a little statement, if you will not mind. The US annual renewable energy consumption in 2019 surpassed coal-based energy consumption for the first time in more than 130 years, according to the US Energy Information Administration. Coal energy dropped for the sixth consecutive year in 2019 and decreased 15% from 2018, largely because of the growth in solar and wind, which increased for the fourth year in a row and surpassed hydro for the first time. So I think the Beyond Coal campaign that Sierra Club has had has something to do with these positive statistics. And Allison is a wonderful representative with Sierra Club. So Allison, take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, and good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here with everyone. Like Catherine said, I, up until about a month ago, had been our New York campaign representative for the Sierra Club's Clean Transportation for All campaign, which is focused on decarbonizing the transportation sector in a just and equitable way. So everything from the electrification of vehicles to supporting public transit, biking and walking, improved urban planning, et cetera. And then I recently switched over to our Beyond Coal campaign, which in New York, we are already beyond coal, thanks to the work of activists and allies. The last coal plant in New York has been shut down. So now I'm really focused on taking on fracked natural gas and making sure that we can get that off of our power grid as fast as possible and replace it with clean wind, solar, and storage. And as Wayne mentioned at the end of his presentation, we've had some really exciting announcements on that front recently, including the announcement that there will be an offshore wind port facility at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, which will include good jobs, community benefits, and really came out of the tireless work of activists and allies, particularly Uprose, which is an environmental justice group based in Brooklyn. But we're talking about transportation tonight, which is very much a passion of mine. So I will jump right in and share my screen and pull up a slideshow. Let's see if this works. Let me go to view. All right, can y'all see this?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I tried to focus in on New York City, and I saw someone actually just posted in the chat about electric buses, which is what a lot of the Sierra Club's clean transportation work in New York City focused on through the Electrify New York Coalition, which is a mix of labor partners, environmentalists, environmental justice groups, and transit advocates focused on electrifying New York City's bus fleet and really enhancing bus electrification statewide. But in New York City, electrification of vehicles is obviously a huge thing, but we also kind of have the unique role of being one of the most transit-rich cities in the world, really. And New Yorkers have some of the lowest per capita emissions rates, largely because so many of us are able to live car-free. People, can walk to the stores, walk to doctor's appointments, rely on the metro and buses and bike lanes to get around. So we're kind of starting a little further ahead than a lot of other cities in terms of tackling our transportation emissions. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of work to do as well. And I think in the pandemic, we've seen some people say, I want to get a car to stay off transit and things like that. And so being able to prioritize EVs for people who feel like they need a car and to be able to make car ownership a less desirable option as opposed to not needing to rely on a car and being able to take transit and get around actively is really important for our city specifically. So some of the overall challenge, and this is New York State specific, is that because, like I said, we already got coal off of our power grid. We still have to take on frack gas and oil, but our power grid is a lower proportion of our emissions statewide. Buildings and transportation are sort of the two biggest segments and what we really need to tackle if we're going to meet our long-term carbon emissions goals. And part of the reason transportation is such a big problem here is largely because of motor vehicles. So on this slide, you can see kind of broken out by sector. Electric power is green at the top. You can see it's come down a ton over the past 15, 20 years as we've seen renewables come onto the market. We've had activists help shut down coal and frack gas. But in transportation, you can see that the blue line is actually going up. And that is largely because, this is sort of interesting, as the economy recovers, people tend to drive more. So even though our vehicles have gotten cleaner and CAFE standards have improved over the past few years, people are also driving more. So even as they have cleaner vehicles, if they're not EVs, we're seeing higher emissions rates. And obviously the actions of the Trump administration over the past 4 years to try and roll back clean car standards was really deleterious and would have been one of the worst climate actions they'd have taken if they'd been able to implement that. Luckily, a wide group of activists, attorney generals, et cetera, challenged those rules. And now that we have the Biden administration in the White House, we're seeing really positive talks about actually strengthening those and exceeding the Obama era standards, which is one of the, in terms of emissions reductions, one of the biggest things our country could do to reduce carbon emissions. So, let's see if I can go to the next slide. 1 second. There we go. Okay. So breaking down those blue blocks a little bit further, in New York State, light duty vehicles or passenger cars account for the vast majority of our emissions. There are about 10.5 million vehicles on the road in New York. And unfortunately, they last a pretty long time. The average is 15.5 years. So that means that vehicles that are coming on the road today, if they're not EVs, they're going to be continuing to emit for 15, 20 years, which starts to really run up against that timeline that Wayne was talking about of, the need for New York State to have 85% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2050. And we start to have a problem, basically, if we don't rapidly shift away from bringing gas burning vehicles onto the road and start either not bringing new vehicles onto the road for folks who can live that lifestyle, or incentivizing EV adoption so that the vehicles that folks are buying today are going to be clean and continuing to run off of our increasingly clean grid. As you can see, looking at the rest of this little chart over on the left, buses represent a relatively small percentage of the emissions, but I think are a really critical segment for the fact that a huge amount of people interact with them and they kind of are a great test case of EV viability. Buses tend to run more through neighborhoods that suffer a disproportionate impact from air pollution. So having those buses be 100% zero emission free is a huge win for public health. And it's one of the market segments that's, like Wayne was saying, pretty well developed. And there's some great manufacturers like Proterra and BYD who are bringing a lot of models onto the market. And it's an area that we, as the public, have a lot of ability to influence. So, like I said, the Sierra Club's been part of a coalition called Electrify NY. I know the Sierra Niagara group has done a lot with the Niagara Frontier Transportation Authority to push them to have EV adoption in their bus fleet. And so it's an area where we're seeing a lot of progress in New York. And the MTA has committed to have 100% zero emission bus fleet by 2040. And they have, I think, about 15 buses that are zero emission in their fleet right now. And a lot of advocates are trying to make sure that even as they have the current budget struggles they're facing, that they don't back away from those commitments and that they continue to make the necessary investments in charging infrastructure at the bus depots and continue to run the pilots and do training so that our transit agency is ready to have the largest zero emission bus fleet in the country. This just kind of captures some of the breakdown within transportation in another way. So transportation is 36% of New York's greenhouse gas emissions, and about 75% of that is from vehicles. About 25% is from other, which includes like planes, watercraft, etc. So the Sierra Club's Clean Transportation for All campaign has really been more focused on motor vehicles and ground transportation. And part of that is just because a lot of the technology is more developed there. And it's a space where we have a little bit more leverage with governments, public authorities, and with people's individual choices. But I think something really important to emphasize is that with the trajectory we've been going, even with these MTA commitments, some new buses coming online, people buying EVs, business as usual and just continuing with the policies we have is not going to be adequate to meet our climate goals. So even though emissions are projected to decline as battery prices decrease, as more people choose EVs, absent additional policies, the rate of decline is not going to be sufficient for New York to meet that 2050 net zero carbon goal. And so that's where, activists and advocates come in. But I think it's important to take a little bit wider of a lens than just carbon emissions. Our transportation system isn't really working for us in a lot of ways right now. Historically, decisions about where to place highways, where to invest in public transportation, and where to build housing have all created this system where the pollution and emissions from vehicles are concentrated in communities of color. And in many cases, local, state, and federal transportation policies have left communities of color and low-income communities with inadequate access to public transportation, divided by highways, and breathing pollution coming off of highways from suburban commuters who pass through neighborhoods. And then, looking outside the city and rural and suburban communities in New York, there's often pretty inadequate public transit systems and little alternative mobility infrastructure, by which I mean like bike lanes or good sidewalks that are interconnected, which leaves people with no choice but to drive a car or to rely on really limited transit service, which obviously, impacts people's ability to get to work or school or healthcare. So I think as we're thinking about, arriving at our goals in 2050 and, switching to a lower carbon transportation system or a no carbon transportation system, it's also an opportunity to reimagine what our transportation system does for us and to do planning in a different way that corrects some of these historical inequities. And going a little bit deeper than just carbon, the current gasoline-based fuel that we use in our cars, and particularly in diesel trucks, delivery trucks, buses, et cetera, releases really high levels of PM 2.5, which is particulate matter that has been linked to illness and death, and in the COVID-19 pandemic has been one of the major risk factors for increased mortality. Additionally, sulfur dioxide, lead, ozone, and nitrous oxide are all coming out of tailpipes currently and impacting New Yorkers in unequal ways. So there's areas in our city from Astoria up through the South Bronx that are called Asthma Alley because the rate of childhood asthma is 200 times that of the national average. And this is both because of the dirty power plants there, but also because of the major trucking routes and the positioning of highways that leave communities with no choice but to breathe this air that is really, really harmful. So there's some great research on that that's been done by UCS and Harvard and a bunch of other places, but I think it kind of drives home the urgency of transitioning to a zero emission transportation system. People's health is on the line today because of the way that we have designed our roadways and because of the vehicles that people drive. And this kind of has a few more facts about that. Sorry, this is a little depressing, but I think another thing to emphasize, I myself don't own a car. I live in Brooklyn and I rely on my bike to get around. in New York City, even though we have, a very walkable city in some ways, it's a really scary place to be a cyclist. We have a network of bike lanes that isn't interconnected. Sometimes the bike lanes are really just arrows painted in the roadway, which provide a little bit of psychological balm for the cyclist. But when a car is, when a driver, not a car, when a driver is being aggressive or, trying to make that red light, those arrows painted on the roadway do nothing to protect them. And this has had a real toll, even though New York City had a Vision Zero program that's been in place for many years. During the pandemic, we've seen an increase in cyclist deaths, particularly among delivery drivers or delivery cyclists and folks who rely on their bicycle for employment. So, once again, this isn't something that affects every New Yorker equally. It's landing on low-income communities and communities of color the hardest. And it makes people, particularly if they have young kids, feel like, well, I'd rather, be safe and drive a car than run the risk of trying to get around the city by bike, even if, maybe they would prefer to be by bicycle or to have half of their trips be by bicycle. So I think the renewed interest and enthusiasm among our elected officials for tackling climate change can also be hitched to the enthusiasm for safer streets. And we can really, use some of the conversations that we've been having in New York about open streets, about bike lanes, to bring more people in and say, that's actually a climate issue too, because the more we make it an option for people to not rely on a fossil fuel powered vehicle, the lower emissions we'll have. The positive news is that most people are on board with the idea that we very much need to modernize our transportation sector. This is some polling Sierra Club did a couple of years ago. And as you can see across the political spectrum, most New Yorkers believe air pollution is a serious problem. They believe that making this transition to a cleaner system can have a positive impact on jobs, on people's health. And people understand that, investing in electric vehicles, investing in public transportation is going to make communities better and is going to be an economic boom. So I think sometimes EVs or, transportation electrification gets treated as something that is fringe or futuristic, but I think people really see the urgent need to do this. And like Wayne was saying, there's just been leaps and bounds of progress in terms of car manufacturers stepping up the number of models they have available, battery prices coming down. So I think we're like right on the cusp of switching from gasoline being the default to EVs being the default. I feel like I made most of these points, but just as we all know, the climate crisis is incredibly urgent. And I think the one thing I would add here is obviously there's a lot of belt tightening discussions happening in our state. And I know our state budget is looking tight and the MTA faces, a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit. But I think allowing the state to turn to austerity at a time like this will have ramifications that are so much more expensive than the investments that we need to make now in EVs and in safe transportation. And those investments will really pay dividends in terms of avoided deaths, avoided health benefits, and the avoided impacts of warming climate that is going to create more superstorms, more polar vortexes and massive snowfalls. So I think it's on all of us to let our elected officials know, let decision leaders know that, climate cannot be on the line as far as budget negotiations. And, if that requires changing the tax system to raise more money or funding certain things less, stopping subsidies to fossil fuel companies, that should be where our head is at, because switching to a better, cleaner, more reliable and affordable EV and electrified transportation system is going to be the path, I think, to real economic recovery and to a livable climate for the future. So this is sort of running over, since Wayne focused a lot on EVs, I kind of framed up some of the non-car solutions we can implement. So zero emission buses, like I said, is a huge one. And I think where we're at with the MTA is needing to hold them accountable to procuring those buses and doing it in a timely manner. Folks might have ridden the 14th Street busway before we all started staying home. And there's the Sierra Club is supportive of fights in every borough to get dedicated busways, which increase bus speed and reliability. And I think, again, going back to those MTA budget cuts, I think making sure that frequent and reliable bus service is a priority for the city is really important to keeping New York as a leader in, being a low emission transportation hub. Additionally, the subway has suspended 24-hour service, as many of us probably know. They are still running trains from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., but not allowing anyone on them. And this is really devastating for folks who work night shifts, need to get around at that time. They're relying on Ubers or needing to purchase a car instead, or making it work in some other way. And that's not just ridiculous because we are still running those trains. And we now know, as we've learned more about the COVID-19 pandemic, that wiping down surfaces during that area is not the priority in terms of enhancing public safety. It's making sure people have proper protective gear, enforcing mask wearing, and running frequent service so that people can be distanced on train cars. So I think that is just a priority that we all as New Yorkers should fight for, even if we don't need to ride the subway during that time. I think it sets a really dangerous precedent in terms of our 24-hour city not actually having 24-hour subway service. Like I mentioned, I'm very passionate about bike lanes. We had a big win recently where Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that it would be building protected bike lanes on the Manhattan Bridge and the Brooklyn Bridge, or the Brooklyn Bridge and the Queensboro Bridge. The Manhattan Bridge already has a dedicated bike lane. Currently, if you've ever biked over the Brooklyn Bridge, you are sharing a rather narrow walkway with pedestrians, many of whom are trying to get that perfect shot of the beautiful stonework. And it is a very bumpy and fraught ride in terms of pedestrian and bicyclist safety. And I think that's a major win. There was a large coalition fighting for that called Bridges for People. But I think there's a lot more the city could do. And there's calls to build out, hundreds of miles of protected, dedicated bike lanes throughout the city, which I think would do a lot to allow people to live and circulate freely without needing to rely on a car. A few other things there. The city has a real dearth of secure bicycle parking. I know many of my friends have had bikes stolen or their seat stolen or a wheel stolen, which makes it really hard to get around. And Transportation Alternatives, which is a transit advocacy group, recently did a study, and they found that this is a widespread issue among New Yorkers in terms of the lack of bicycle parking influencing when people ride and if they feel comfortable bringing their bike out. And in buildings, I, for example, live in a third floor walk-up, carry my bike up and down the stairs every time I come in. It's a good workout, but sometimes I wish I didn't have to do that. So there's building code reforms that could take place, particularly in people's workplaces once we're going back in, to require buildings to have safe, secure bicycle storage so people can get around that way. And then I think there's an important role for green infrastructure and social policy. Things like, obviously, most of us are working from home now if we are able to, but allowing those kinds of flexible policies, even once it's safe to go back into workplaces, even if it's just 1 or 2 days a week, can reduce the strain on roadways, make for less congested roads, less time people are spending driving, reduce the strain on the transit system so we're not all packed in like sardines at 9 a.m. And particularly in areas where folks have a long commute, just letting people work from home a few days a week could really do a lot to actually reduce emissions from the vehicles they currently have. And as many of us probably experienced during the pandemic, having safer streets where you can actually play with your kids or walk your dog and not be crowded onto a little portion of the sidewalk when there's a whole street out there being shared by cars, I think would also be a major climate win. And I put reducing free parking there, probably controversial if there's any car owners on the call, but there's been some really interesting studies done that find, I think right now New York City dedicates about the area of Central Park just to free parking, which is a lot of public space that, normally you have to pay to occupy public space or use it for your own exclusive use and not have it be shared, but car owners don't. And so we're basically creating a condition where we're incentivizing people to own a car that maybe they don't actually need. And I think there's ways that could be reduced with an equity lens where folks who rely on their car for critical mobility needs or because they have young children or live somewhere really far away, there could be a permitting system with the city. But right now, a lot of our public space is given to housing vehicles, which, as we talked about, are hurting our health, hurting the planet, and taking space that could be used for recreation and zero emission mobility. So I think there's sort of a couple of ways to think about those policies. One category is kind of providing more transportation choices, and then the other is discouraging motor vehicle travel. So I talked a lot about those things. Congestion pricing is a fight people might have seen a couple of years back. Now that we have the Biden administration, that should finally move forward, which will also provide more funding for the MTA and hopefully discourage car use in Manhattan. So one area I would encourage folks to look to get involved and make your voice heard on these things is the Climate Action Council process. Last year, the state passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which set a lot of those climate goals we've been talking about. And right now they're in the process of figuring out what is their plan to meet them. And so that Climate Action Council has work groups who've been having public input sessions and the opportunity for people to provide comments. So at the end of the slide, I have our CTFA organizer, Jess's contact info. So if you're interested in speaking at one of those or getting more engaged in advocacy around that, you should feel free to connect with her. And like Wayne was saying, I think as important as the bike and pedestrian and transit policies I've been talking about are, the single most high impact policy solutions are those that switch fossil fuel burning vehicles to electric vehicles. And the main barrier to electric vehicle adoption right now is the higher upfront cost of an EV compared to a similar ICE vehicle. So reducing that price disparity until they're actually market cost competitive is one of the most important climate actions the state could take. And that could include increasing the size of the rebate for folks who buy an EV, expanding EV charging infrastructure so people can actually feel confident if they get an EV, they'll be able to fuel up. And policies like putting a price on pollution so that we're reflecting a little bit better the true cost of burning fossil fuels on society. And this kind of runs through them as well. So that's what I got. Like I said, Jess Ensman is our fabulous CTFA organizer for New York State. If you want to be more involved in advocacy around any of these things, I'd encourage you to reach out to her. And at the link I have there is a report the Sierra Club did back in 2019 that looked at what actions and what scale of actions is the state going to need to take to meet our climate goals and achieve transportation emissions reductions. And that report includes the call for the state to set an interim target for transportation emissions reductions of 55% by 2035, so that we have a goalpost before 2050, which feels like a long way away, to know if we're actually on track to meeting our climate goals. And thank you all for spending time with me tonight. Hope it was enjoyable. And thank you so much to the New York City group and Catherine for inviting me to join.
Well, thank you, Allison. Thank you. That was very enlightening and just fantastic. Thank you so very much. And now I would like to see if I can put up this poll. There are a few questions here, and you might want to take a moment and just answer yes or no to the questions. And then if we have time, we'll get the percentage back. Okay, so just click. Can everybody see the poll? Can you see the poll? Can everybody see the poll? Okay. Oh, wait, it didn't really. Let's see. I don't think if there was a chance to get it up for everybody having a chance to answer.
Yeah, it showed very quickly, Catherine.
Yeah, it was too quick. Okay, let me see if I can okay, allow. Okay, I think we're gonna have to let that poll go. I'm gonna try this one more time because it wasn't supposed to end so quickly here. Okay, we'll have to do a poll another time. That for some reason didn't work correctly. Okay, we do have a few questions here. And one of the questions from Irene is, what kind of mandates are in the CLCPA? I don't know who wants to answer that.
I can jump in and then.
Okay, go ahead, Allison.
Yes, the CLCPA gets pretty specific on mandates for the power sector. We need to have 100% carbon-free grid by 2040, 70% renewable portfolio standard by 2030. And economy-wide, we need to have 85% emissions reductions from 1990 levels by 2050. On transportation, though, the CLCPA didn't really set many clear mandates. And this is a big problem because, getting from here to 85% net zero by 2050 is going to require the biggest decreases in the transportation sector. Like I said, that's the largest contributor right now. So I think the Climate Action Council process, which is sort of taking the broad goals and the broader structure and mandate of the CLCPA and converting it into an actionable plan, is a major area for advocates and activists to really weigh in and get the state to set some mandates of, of the type Wayne was talking about and I was talking about, whether that be transit agencies can't procure zero emission buses past 2030 or 2035, maybe saying all government vehicles, like Wayne was saying, need to be zero emission by 2025, or that, agencies can't procure non-zero emission vehicles past 2025. I think getting more and more of those mandates in place both sends a really good market signal and also will help us have that accountability to make sure that we're staying on track for the climate goals that we are bound by law to meet.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Allison. And there was a question at some point by a participant in the difference between electrification and decarbonization. And some people think that there's carbon in nuclear, which actually there is carbon in nuclear. So nuclear can't be considered in decarbonization, although some people include it. But the difference is that electrification is in and of itself one thing, and decarbonization can include electrification, but other aspects as well. Allison, if you just want to give a very brief statement of the extension of decarbonization in addition to electrification, because you mentioned some of those things as well.
Yeah, I think decarbonization just kind of looks beyond simply the technology we're using and looks at the choices people are making and the emissions impact those can have. So when we're talking about decarbonizing transportation, one of the tools in our toolbox is reducing the number of vehicle miles traveled, which maybe is providing things like safe bike lanes or more transit options. So someone can say, oh, I only need to take my car once a week to drive to my mom's house. The rest of my trips I can do on foot or with these other zero emission means. And so that's like a way to have decarbonization that's not purely electrifying.
Okay, thank you, Allison.
If I could add 2 cents there.
Okay, sure.
I agree that decarbonization is a fairly general term, and electrification is more specific. So a bill ideally should not specify the technology, it should specify the goal. So that's why this proposed legislation and others mostly call for zero emission vehicles, not necessarily electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, to give technology companies the leeway to find the best solution. In practice, regarding the vehicles that New York City buys, they will be electric vehicles. But the language of the bill should be general. But so, yeah, I agree. Decarbonization is a fairly general term, and electrification is one aspect of it.
Thank you for that clarification, both of you, Wayne and Allison. And Wayne, where are we on by we, I mean New York City Council on this legislation? Is it in the beginning stages? Is it going to council members? What stage of the process are we in? Because it's such an excellent piece of legislation. We'd all like to see it pass tomorrow, of course.
Sure.
Where are we on it?
Well, I've reached out to one council member who was a logical choice, and we got some good feedback from his legislative director, but he's term limited. So he suggested working with a council member who is not term limited. So I'm actually working with some of your colleagues for input as to who we should turn to next. And so as soon as we have consensus, we'll take that next step and approach another council member. So we are trying to make some progress.
Thank you. A brief comment I'd like to make is, I don't know if any of you know the organization We Act, but they're basically up north in Harlem. And they started very early on trying to get safe buses because they're in the Asthma Alley and they had bus depots and so forth. And they worked very hard to get safe buses. They were probably ahead of the curve on getting electric buses. So they are to be applauded. The other comment I would like to make is Costa Constantinides, who is one of the council members, New York City council members, at the end of the year, 2018 or 2019, I don't remember, but it was the last hearing of the year. He had it on electric school buses. So it was a hearing just to hear what is the status, what are the different companies, and I attended and gave testimony at that hearing. But one of the things I was surprised to learn, I'll just share very briefly, is that indoor air on school buses is worse than outdoor air, especially on the diesel buses. It's terrible for the children and for the students. So I definitely have my vote, all of us, to get these school buses electrified as soon as possible.
And one insight about this proposed bill is until now, cities have worked on some of these segments, but not all of them together. And now the technology has advanced so much and the costs have come down so much versus traditional vehicles that a city can adopt a policy that addresses all vehicles, not just one segment. So you're right, some cities have focused on transit buses, some cities have focused on school buses, some cities have focused on taxis, but now the progress is there so that we can focus on all vehicles that New York City purchases or leases or licenses.
Okay. What's one thing, how are we doing on our time? We're a couple minutes over. If you don't mind staying for a couple moments, what's one thing that that you would recommend, each of you, that as citizens we can do? And I know there's so many things that we can do. Use public transportation instead of driving cars, taxis, or Ubers. But what is one thing that you might encourage our participants and citizens to do to help us electrify and decarbonize our city? If it's two or three things, but what is at least one thing you would recommend as citizens do to help this along the way? Engage with their elected officials on the issue. What do you think's important that you'd like to leave our citizens and participants with? Allison, do you want to go first? You're smiling. Are you ready?
Sure. Yeah, I have to drop off at 8:30, so I'll have to leave after this comment. I think, like you said, Catherine, contacting your elected officials all the way from your city council member up to the governor and let them know that you think this is an urgent priority and that you support not just things like restarting 24-hour service of the MTA, building protected bikeways, but also that you support electrification and that you know that we need both, because I think sometimes those get pitted as two different options when I think they're both going to be critical for decarbonizing. tell the governor we need to set an interim target for transportation and pass EV-friendly bills.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you for your wonderful, wonderful presentation. And we hope to see you soon. Okay. And Wayne, what about you? What's at least one thing you would like to recommend to our participants?
Sure, I'll leave two. One is once we at the Sierra Club figure out which council member we're approaching, then we'll keep the audience appraised to reach out to the council member that represents you and make that council member aware of the bill. And that's how progress happens. So to be active in supporting this. The second thing is to the extent that, of course, use public transportation where you can. That's highly efficient from an emissions point of view. But if you do find yourself in the market for a new vehicle, buy an electric vehicle.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you so, so much.
Thanks.
That's going to be, I'm driving a 2003 Honda Civic Hybrid, not a plug-in hybrid. And I'm going to be due. So it's like, what, 18 years old. So I'm going to be due.
Yeah, it's almost time, maybe.
Yeah, it sure is. Thank you so much, Wayne. That was absolutely wonderful. And we hope to post this on our website.
Terrific. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Good night.